Hi everyone, my name is Vanessa van Dijk, and in today's video I want to talk about this phrase we hear all the time when it comes to acne or breakouts. It's just hormonal, which usually translates into, well, you can't really do anything about it. Now for me personally, it has been a very different experience, because I started tracking everything very carefully over the last 2 years. I wrote down what I ate, when I ate it, what I did during the day, when I had my period, how it was, along with any symptoms. And of course pictures of my entire face, back and chest. And there were months where my hormones should have technically been active, and yet my skin was completely fine. So I started thinking, okay, if hormones are supposedly the root cause, then why are they behaving differently under different conditions? Because that would imply that something else changed first. And this is where I think the entire modern framing around acne becomes really strange. Because today, especially online, there's this huge consensus built around the idea that hormones are basically the beginning of the chain. But when I started looking into older dermatology textbooks, I realized that this actually wasn't always the dominant way of thinking. If you go back before around the 1960s, people like Marion Schulzberger didn't describe hormones as the master of acne. They described them more like messengers, which means hormones were responding to something, not randomly creating acne out of nowhere like the current consensus is built around. And the thing they believed hormones were responding to was metabolism and diet. And honestly, this made way more sense to me. Because based on all my testing and self-tracking, everything kept pointing towards the idea that there was something I was consuming or doing that was triggering the reaction in the first place. So essentially, hormones are communication systems. And if you actually look up the definition, hormones are described as chemical messengers produced by glands and tissues in the endocrine system, which basically just means they carry signals. So then the real question becomes, what is creating the signal? And I think a good way of thinking about it would be smoke coming from a house. The smoke is the hormonal flare-up, but the smoke didn't start the fire. Something underneath caused it first. And what's interesting is that older dermatology actually focused much more on the fuel underneath the reaction. For example, back in the 1940s, some older dermatologists even drew parallels between acne and blood sugar regulation, using terms like skin diabetes because they saw strong links between metabolism, inflammation, and the skin. They believed certain foods basically gave the body instructions. Things like dairy, chocolate, salt, pork, nuts, fried foods, refined carbohydrates. These weren't seen as random details. They were seen as metabolic triggers. But then over time, that entire perspective kind of disappeared. And I think part of it happened for the exact same reason I talked about in my last video with the chocolate studies. Medicine increasingly moved toward models that work extremely well for testing drugs, but not necessarily for studying complex lifestyle patterns. Because the double-blind placebo-controlled trial, which modern medicine treats as the gold standard, is incredibly good at testing isolated chemicals. But acne is not an isolated chemical problem. It's a systemic response. And diets are almost impossible to properly blind. You can blind a pill, but you cannot blind whether somebody drinks milk every day. And I think this created a huge bias towards treatments that suppress the messenger instead of asking what created the signal in the first place. So when people tell me, Melissa, you can't ignore hormones, well, I'm not ignoring them. I'm just asking why they're reacting. Because I think that's a completely different question. And honestly, realizing this changed the entire way I looked at my skin. Because instead of seeing hormones as this random, uncontrollable force, I started seeing them more like a response system. And by the way, when people say, well, that's old research, that is not the right framing. We didn't disprove a lot of those older ideas. We just stop teaching them. And personally, I think part of the reason is because lifestyle-based explanations are much harder to standardize into products and treatments. But your body itself hasn't changed. It still reacts to signals. And I think that a lot of you notice that, even if modern acne discussions often dismiss it. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one. Bye.